Years ago in school, I was very fortunate enough to have the opportunity to go with several students and some of our teachers on a trip to Greece. And while we were on this trip, we actually did get to go to the Areopagus that is discussed in the Acts of the Apostles reading that we read this morning. Now, the Areopagus is also known as Mars Hill. It's where in ancient times the marketplace would have been, and it's also where the seat for the judiciary would have been in Athens. It's not very far from the Acropolis in Athens, just to orient you, the probably more famous landmark that's there. Also, unlike the Acropolis, the Areopagus, all that really is left there is the hill itself. It's really just a bunch of jagged rocks that you can go up and walk among, but there's really not much there to really see what it would have been like in Paul's day. Now, when we were there, there's a plaque as you get ready to go and walk up to the Areopagus. And one of our teachers, one of the main ones leading this trip, Bill Wortman, he looked at this plaque in Greek of this very passage that we read here today from Acts of the Apostles. And Bill Wortman, showing his knowledge of the classics, went and was reading off of that passage as he was explaining to us what this passage was about. Now, the whole point of this trip was to get a sense not only of classical Greece, but of the early Christian history as well, really just all of the history of Greece. And Bill is a very devout Christian, so which we all knew, and he could speak to what was going on in Acts, not only from the standpoint as a scholar, but from the standpoint of a believer, which was a very valuable lesson for all of us to have. So Bill is standing there, again, just a devout Christian and great scholar. He was one of the first ones to help teach me biblical Hebrew even. And he's standing there giving this speech to us about what's going on in this passage. Now, we as students were a captive audience, which isn't to say Bill is an incredible teacher. He is very captivating. None of us had any hard time listening to him. And the people around us didn't have a hard time listening to him either. There were quite a number of folks, tourists and other people walking around, who stopped. The few moments that I had a chance to look around, I saw all these different people that just stopped and were looking and kind of were joining in with our group to listen to what it was that Bill had to say. Even though they weren't part of our group, even though what we were learning might not have been something that one would immediately think would have interested other people, they stopped. They listened. They were interested. They wanted to hear what it was that this random American standing there had to say. What Paul was saying was very similar. And the words that Paul was trying to convey, the message of the gospel, the good news of God and Jesus Christ, these were things that very much interested people. They were very much things that people wanted to hear. That's what we see in this gospel today, and it's what we see even now in not only people like Bill Wortman sharing the story, but others who have followed and others who are with us still, proclaiming this good news and telling the story of Jesus. Now, with Paul, he knows that the Athenians are people who are searching. These are a group of people who were known for philosophy, who were known for their piety, with the Acropolis not far from here, dedicated to the pantheon of Greek gods. And there were gods for just about anything you could imagine. And even in the midst of that, even in the midst of more gods than we could possibly ever want to have to give up offerings to, there's still one more. There's still this altar that Paul finds in the city that's dedicated to the unknown God. So even with all these different things, everything that could be imagined, there was still something more that the Athenians knew that they didn't know. And that is because, in fact, what they didn't know is beyond anything that they could imagine. Because not only is this unknown God not in one of these temples, not at one of these shrines, not only was this a God that didn't need the service of other people, this was a God who was not a created thing, as we hear so often about the gods in Greek mythology. This is a God that stood beyond anything that the Greeks could have ever imagined. This is a God that stood above as creator of the world. This is a God that didn't need to be served like the other gods were. In fact, this is a God who helped others, who helps humanity out. Paul even points the Athenians to their own philosophers, their own thinkers, to get a sense of who this unknown God really is. With the quotes like, "In him we live and move and have our being." The idea that God has created us. And from the poets as well, "For we too are his offspring. We too are part of that created order that God has made." Now, this is not to say that the Athenians were in any stretch of the means on the right path of figuring things out. They were not. Not at all. But Paul takes what they do know. Paul takes where they have been and uses that to help them. He says, "I realize you have been in this search. I can see where this search has led you. And I'm here to tell you that that search for that thing you have been longing for so long is now over. This unknown God that you have been seeking is right here, has been here all along. And let me share with you some of the things that this God has shown me." That is essentially what Paul is saying to the Athenians this morning. And if we look at our world today, this search for answers, these questions hidden deep inside us, this search for this God that may sometimes seem unknowable, is still going on today. We see it in all the many things that the world has to offer, that other people have to offer to us. We see it from the self-help books that litter the shelves. We see it from the pseudo-spiritual techniques that people try to teach others. We see it in all of these things. And just like with the Athenians, these things show that we're on the search. They also show that we are often not on the right path. But if we keep searching, here is the opening that Paul and so many others have provided for us to take. Others may take the more tried and true methods, those methods of philosophy and poetry, just as we see with the Athenians, just as Paul offers up as well. Now, these are more tried and true methods, and they do help us a little bit further on that journey, just as we see with Paul and the Athenians. But we still need that extra step. We still need to have that path illuminated for us. They may get us to the start, but it's Jesus who helps take us all the way through. Many still have questions in their lives. For many, there's still that hole that we try to fill with so many different things. Those questions that we fill with so many different answers. And yet, none of those things seem to satisfy us. Well, that's what Paul is here to do today. And it's what so many others that have followed him since are here to do. They're here to point us to those answers. They're here to fill that hole within us. They're here to guide us to the path to feeling whole once again, the path to renewal that we've been hearing about these past several weeks, this path back to God and in relationship with our Lord. So as we continue to move forward, as we continue to ask those questions, we know that those questions will always be asked. Those questions will always be things that human beings will be searching for. They're things that will always be relevant to us. And fortunately for us, and for anyone else on our path that we can share this with, the answer to those questions that we will always have is always going to be Jesus.